Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight is a timely discussion talking about conservation efforts across the continent, as well as those in Kigali. We're going to be looking at biodiversity conservation. We're going to be looking at climate change adaptation, as well as financing to counter some of these issues. This conversation is happening on the sidelines of the Africa Protected Areas Congress, happening in Kigali with over 2,000 participants, the first of its kind, gathering leaders and people involved, actors involved in conservation for the first time. And I am happy to welcome with us our guests. And I'll start with our guest, African Wildlife Foundation CEO, Mr. Kadu Sebunya. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Looking forward to the conversation with you. We also have with us Beatrice Chiza, who is the Director General of Environment and Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment. Beatrice, welcome. A warm welcome to you tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Great. My name's Dan Mpisi, host of The Square. As always, I'm joined by The Square's 10 panelists. And I'll start with you, Berna. Great to have you on the show. Great. We are also joined by Charles Haber. Great to have you on The Square.
Same here, Dan. How are you?
Good, as always. Any midweek highlights before we kick off?
COVID is bothering me, and numbers seem to be spiking. Over the weekend, some people attending events were being required to produce COVID tests. I went to 2 public offices and were being reminded to mask up. But this is just a reminder that vaccines work. I think the reasons why we haven't had a huge spike in cases, especially people falling sick per se, is predominantly because of vaccines.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Have you taken your 3rd jab? Of course.
I'm waiting for the 4th.
Okay. Brenna, any midweek highlights? None. Okay, so we'll kick off. And to our viewers, keep the conversation going on our social media feed using #TheSquareRW. We'll be reading your tweets later on. And yes, like I said, we're here to talk about conservation efforts on the continent. And the first question I'd really like is to put forward to you, Mr. Kadu Sebunya. On the sidelines of the African Protected Areas Congress, Rwanda, I'd like to address this, first to Beatrice Chiza. Rwanda officially launched the Nyandungu Ecotourism Park. I think many of us in this country are really excited about it. It's an urban wetland that has been transformed from a degraded wetland to an educational and recreational facility, the first of its kind in Kigali. Beatrice, if you could just share with us briefly, to kick off the conversation, an overview of Rwanda's biodiversity efforts to date.
Thank you, Dan. To begin with, even though you've seen the conservation efforts through the Nyandungu Ecotourism Park, but that's a program which comes from the policies, the laws, and the strategies that are put in place. So we have the biodiversity policy, which is dated from 2011. And this very policy emphasizes on how we need to protect biodiversity, not only for our own good, for people's good, but also for economic development, which is linked with ecosystem services, but also to prevent the biodiversity loss. So that was one of the policies set. We have also the strategies that are set for us to implement the biodiversity conservation concepts. And we also have different tools, really. So the Nyandungu Ecotourism Park is like a result and a pilot or an example of what good biodiversity laws and policies can result of. So the Nyandungu Ecotourism Park has been rehabilitated, and if you remember, back in the years, that park was really very degraded. Overgrazing, sand mining was just happening there, but now it's really a very good ecosystem which is rehabilitated with new species coming in, restoration, and really this is an example of the efforts of the government of Rwanda. So I'll pause here, maybe after all, after the conversation, I'll keep on giving you some examples of what the conservation efforts of Rwanda have come with.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, I'd like to hear a bit more of the is it Gishwati? I think one of the other, protected areas, looking at our parks, and that sort of thing as a country. So we'll definitely be coming back to you, Beatrice. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Sebunya, great to have you on the show. And I know you must be really busy, so it's an honor having you here with us tonight on the sidelines of APAC. And, my next question is to you with regards to conservation efforts. Africa accounts for 30% of global biodiversity, but we know, especially following the conference and preparations for it, biodiversity efforts are quite dismal by African actors. And my question to you is, on a continental level, if you can outline to us the status of implementation, policy, as well as investment when it comes to biodiversity on a continental level. Just a quick snapshot.
Thank you very much. I think, like you just said, Africa has 30% of global biodiversity is found on this continent. So we've done a good job because other continents are way behind compared to Africa. We have about more than 8,600 protected and conservation areas across the continent, almost about 6 million square kilometers of land on the continent is under protection and conservation. And these are the anchors of biodiversity. It's the massive land, the size of Australia, or about 25 or to 28 times the size of UK, just in comparison. So we've done a good job as Africans, but there are challenges. There are financial challenges. There are systems are not in place. I said 8,600 protected areas, but from our assessment, about less than 2,000 protected areas are really under proper management. We have done a study to manage protected areas properly. They need about between $500 to $1,000 per square kilometer. Right now, currently, on average in Africa, we are managing our protected areas below 50% per kilometer, per square kilometer. So there is a deficit, despite the fact that we are holding that 30% of biodiversity in the world. And you can, in the first question, you asked from your studios is that how was COVID? And I smiled because if we are doing a very good job in conservation in Africa, there wouldn't be any virus out. So conservation, the connection between conservation and health is real. The viruses are in wild lands. The virus are on wildlife. If we succeed as conservationists, then our health systems succeed globally. If we are successful with the conservation, our water will be better. If we succeed in conservation, our food security, because of rain, our agriculture, 70% depends on rainfall, so we'll get food security and feed our populations. So in general, we are doing fairly well. The biggest challenge currently now is the choices we are making between development and conservation. There's an idea that somehow we can develop first and conserve later, or conservation is against development, which in our view is a false choice.
Thank you very much. I just want to follow up, Mr. Sebunya, with you talked about we're doing fairly well, but still there's more to be done. One of the things that is fairly common when it comes to conservation efforts on the continent is that they're usually done by non-African actors or non-African institutions over the years. What's your take on that? What do you think needs to change? What sort of narrative needs to change if we're really going to spearhead? We account for, as a continent, 30% of biodiversity. We should be in the driver's seat. So what do you think needs to change? What message would you give, especially policymakers, on this issue?
I lead the largest African conservation organization on the continent, the oldest conservation across the continent. It's an African NGO, and that's how it should be. Conservation is led mostly on the continent either international NGOs play a bigger role on the continent, and when it comes to Africans, it's mostly white Africans. Black Africans, majority of us, haven't really been so much involved. And there are reasons for that in the sector. Right, this conference we are having here in Kigali, one of the themes on the opening day at a high-level panel, the main theme was we needed to decolonize conservation on the continent to be successful. And when you break that down, it's really Africans, especially Black Africans, we need to take the lead in managing our resources, because these are our resources. We can't outsource management and financing of assets we need for our own development. Currently, 70% of the funding of conservation on the continent is donor. And almost more than 70% of management systems are being built by international NGOs on the continent. You cannot put aside assets that are the richest resources the continent has in the hands of people who have done a good job. It's not that they're bad people, they've done a good job, but going forward, as Africa grows our population, which is now current at 1.2 billion people, we are going to be 2.4 billion people. The choices those people and their leaders are going to make on how we transport ourselves, how we urbanize, how we deal with food security of 2.4 billion people, how we deal with our sources of water, the choices we make on our sources of energy are the ones that are going to determine the space left for conservation. So we need to step up and fill the gap in terms of our responsibilities to nature. But I just want to point out the background to why this is happening. One is that the decolonization of conservation, which we've had almost for the last 2 days at the conference, one of the examples I'll tell you is that Africa has not been able to sit down, like you said in your introduction of the segment. For the first time, we are sitting down to discuss about protected areas and conservation areas. Where are they? What are they for? How helpful are they? Do we need them? Who is managing them? What's working? What's not working? What's our role? What's the role of international community? That has never happened. So what we did when we got independence, we borrowed everything colonialists left us, where the parks are. We haven't changed that. How they are managed, systems. We haven't changed much of that. That's why we've carried on the protectionism of conservation. It has become so expensive to run a conservation project. You need rangers, they need guns, they need to be put in kind of a military uniform, they need vehicles and pickups they can jump off and protect wildlife, which was a colonial idea that wildlife and these lands needed to be protected from Africans. We should have changed that philosophy when we gained independence and said, no, these are our assets. We really don't need protectionism. So what we've done, what we've learned, and actually Rwanda has been leading and a few other countries on the continent, the idea that you need to put people at the center of conservation. And that has been the theme going on at the conference. People need to be at the center of conservation. Conservation cannot be an end in itself. It has to have a meaning to Africans, whether economically, culturally, or socially.
Thank you. I really like what you said, Mr. Sebenya, regarding decolonizing conservation, and I'm really looking forward to the outcomes of APAC happening in Kigali, this week. Beatrice, I'd like to come to you before I go to the squarers and panelists. And earlier on I was talking about the Gishwati Mukura Reserve. If you could give a couple of other examples in terms of biodiversity conservation, some tangible examples of other efforts that have been fruitful, and just also briefly, if you can link it to how we put conservation at the heart of our policies, you know. So just if you can briefly touch on that.
Thank you, Dan. To begin with, just to complement what Mr. Sibunya has just said about the decolonization and how we're going to have our own ways of managing the protected areas. So if we look at the way we were protecting our areas, where we have to have it like a clause with firm legal framework that goes with it, where we have no access for people, and even if it's for tourism, people like normal people who have no really good means could not access, and yet those are our assets. So I think this is something we really need to tackle, and Rwanda has shown a good example that this is possible. For example, as you said, for the Mukura-Gishwati National Park, this is the 4th national park of Rwanda. And if you remember, this wasn't a park before. It was just degraded as any other degraded areas. And with all the efforts, back in the 90s, this was really a chaos. There were no new species, there were biodiversity laws, and the life inside the forest were really not as good as it should be. When we talk about the ecosystem services, it should have been provided. So those were really the challenges with that forest. But with the conservation efforts, the government managed to link the Mukura-Gishwati and bring it to the status of a national park, which is now a fourth national park. And not only a park, but also now it has become a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. So this is really a good conservation effort we've made. If I can also maybe mention a little bit about the gorilla, the mountain gorillas we have in Rwanda. You know, these were really a very critically endangered species, which were in the red list of the IUCN. And with the efforts we made, we have managed to get, in 2000, we have 395, I guess, gorillas in the Virunga Massif. And due to the efforts, in 2019, they almost doubled to 600 and something. So this is a good effort of conservation that needs to be done. And as Sebunya said, people in the center of conservation. Whatever we do, it's just like not doing it for the sake of conserving, not doing it for the sake of having tourists coming to visit, but people at the center of whatever we do. Someone said in the panel, in the APAC Congress, we were saying, he said, when we start talking about conservation versus people, or people protection versus conservation, that's already a failure. So it is interlinked. You can't talk about conservation when you don't talk people, and you can't talk about community living in the neighborhood or inside those at the surrounding of those protected areas without also talking about the conservation efforts. Those are the custodians of those protected areas, if I can call them that way. And coming back to the Virunga and the National Park of the Volcanoes National Park, you know, we have this revenue sharing scheme that we are now implementing. And 10% of the revenue that comes from the use of the park, the tourism, goes back to the community. What does it mean? It means we have schools, we have health centers at the center and at the surrounding of that protected area, which means those people, the surrounding community, will also be part of the conservation. So this is, I think, the efforts the government is having. And coming back to the Nyandungu Eco-Tourism Park, I was saying, not only in the rural areas, but even in town, we can try to see if we can have efforts of conserved and protected area in the towns. And Nyandungu Eco-Tourism Park is one of them, and we are yet to find all other programs to continue implementing this kind of nature-based solutions in the country. So I think this is it, but let me link it a little bit with the questions you asked before about the planning, the policies, and the government efforts, I think all these are done through the government's planning processes and policy settings. And once we set policies, I think it's very necessary to see them implemented at the local level, especially into the medium and long-term strategies at the district level, at the sector level, being it an agriculture, be it all the sectors, because at the end of the day, conservation does not go, it's not like a standalone concept, but it is interlinked with different other concepts in the country and different other sectors. I think these are some of the highlights I could give when it comes about conservation efforts of Rwanda and also linking it to the policies and plans we have.
Thank you. So are you both hopeful? Are you excited? Are you looking forward to the outcomes of APAC?
So much.
Yeah. You know, I am optimistic. I mean, this is our third day, and we've had excellent conversations at different levels. The first day, we had high-level African leaders. We had a couple of former presidents. We have 52 out of 54 ministers of environment. They've been here in the House. We have all the executive directors of national parks in Africa. They are here. We have indigenous people. We have about 300 representatives of youth in town coming from 36 African countries. They are here. We have some women groups that have been dealing with conservation on the ground. So we have practitioners, and we have several civil societies that are African civil societies that are dealing on a day-to-day issues, from advocacy work to some of the enterprises, communities are running. Then we have also international NGOs. We had the German minister here. We have the British, we have USAID. So it's really global, because one of the things we need to understand is that Africa holds, as you said, 30% of the biodiversity. But it's not for Africa. We are the custodians. And that's our responsibility, is to maintain that biodiversity for the rest of the world. Because the rest of the world needs this biodiversity, especially to fight in the fight we are in of climate change.
Yes.
There is a realization that no country or no continent is going to be successful with climate change issues. As an example, without Africa. Africa, we are victim because we are not responsible for climate change. We are not polluting at any level that can impact this planet. It's the rest of the world who developed recklessly. And
actually,
we are now suffering those consequences.
Yeah.
There have to be a responsibility and a way of payment for Africa to have been holding back.
If I can stop you there, because we are coming to that topic, actually, climate change adaptation and how Africa is bearing the brunt of pollution and climate changes. So I'm sorry, I'll just stop you there, but we're definitely coming back to that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Bernard, Charles, I know none of us are experts in this field, so we're really here to listen more and learn from Mr. Sebunya and Mrs. Chiza. But yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Bernard, I'll kick off with you.
I think it's interesting to hear Africans begin the conversation around decolonization of conservation, because for quite some time now it looks like a buzzword, mainly from the West, as usual, telling Africans what to do. So if you have Africans getting together and saying, let's determine what our priorities are, it is a step in the right direction. But I'm skeptical of the whole process. One, when it comes to finance, and he can correct me as the CEO because he's the expert here, there are few countries that are walking the talk. One of them is Rwanda. At least we have seen that even before it became a buzzword, conservation, Rwanda was already doing it. The journey goes back to when Rwanda banned polythene bags. At that time, nobody understood what Rwanda was trying to achieve. There was a bit of resistance, but Rwanda was consistent. Later on in, I think, 2005, the first Quitizina, when was it? 2005?
Not sure, but I feel like, yes, around
Yeah?
that time, yeah.
Yeah. When they launched the concept,
It was after 2007, anyway,
Yeah?
around that time.
Yeah, when Quitizina was launched, not so many people were excited about it. Most of them thought it was probably just an opportunity to spend money. They didn't understand the concept. We are seeing now the benefits. So, but that's Rwanda. And now they've taken it a notch higher and gone into the revenue sharing. If you go to Musanze now, you can clearly see how it has changed lives there. I wonder if we have so many countries where we can talk about the same level of success. My point is the political will that you need to push some of these ideas. Now, yes, you have representation at the highest level from some of the government agencies, but do we have the political will that is needed to move this agenda? And by that, I mean, we need countries to start allocating money from their national budgets to this cause. Yeah. How many countries are doing that? That is number one. Number two, in terms of walking the talk around the environment, as East Africa, we already agreed that, for instance, we are placing a ban on polythene bags. But we know outside of Rwanda, across the region, we still have that problem. Let's go to conservation. So there are so many, I mean, it's good, they're brilliant ideas, but when you look at the progress so far, it's uneven, and that makes it really difficult in terms of lobbying as Africa, in my view.
As a continent.
Yeah.
Charles?
Yeah, thanks. I think walking the talk is indeed quite a bit of a challenge. And I don't want to be in Kadu's shoes, neither do I want to be in Beatrice's shoes. Because sometimes, you know, when I was coming in here, I played a tennis match at 6. I couldn't stay at the club for a long time because I told them I was going on the studio to talk about conservation. Then this guy told me, but the Conservative Party is in deep trouble. And this is a fairly enlightened person at the club. So I told him no.
Talking about
Yeah.
politics.
So I said, okay, if a person of his caliber does not understand what conservation means, now imagine the layman. So this is how you'd really need to break it down.
Yeah.
Beatrice alluded to activities like sand mining. And I want to talk about food on the table versus conservation, because you can imagine everyone who was mining sand either in Batsinda or in Gisozi or all these other areas around Kigali, then spread it out to the Nyandungu where the park is today, people who had genuine titles that were given by the government of Rwanda to do whatever economic activity that they were intending to do. Spread it out to the entire industrial area of Gikondo that had multitude of factories that were employing hundreds of thousands of people, that were ultimately feeding millions of people that were sent away. Yes, they were relocated somewhere else, but kudos to the government of Rwanda for thinking about that financing and how that's going to work. But food on the table of people that they missed out. So the point I'm raising is sometimes when we become very sophisticated with these buzzwords, as Bana was saying, we forget that there is really bread at people's tables that they are missing out. It's a very tight rope to walk. I know Beatrice did talk about a percentage of the revenues that come from tourism activities that goes to the communities.
10%.
And one fantastic example, I think I have not visited a better community than the Chiniji Modo Village. It's a global standard facility. It is really fantastic. But then when you look at it and break it down to a layman's terms, that truck driver who fetches 5,000 francs on every trip of sand that he gets from Batsinda to where he's going, does he understand what it means to be stopped from fetching that sand from from the river sand, and I think, you know, I'm in the real estate space. I'll tell you for a fact that the best quality sand that we have is river sand. They'll tell you it's Kayumbu. There's a million alternatives to that sand, but the laziest response every contractor will give you that we have rising damp, humidity in our walls because the government of Rwanda banned river sand. I think it's a very lazy excuse. So the point is that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done around the awareness and this, because the fight to be pro-conservation touches onto people's livelihoods, their stomachs. It's you're telling me to plan for my grandchildren, but I don't have a meal tomorrow. Yeah, so I think it's a very tightrope to walk. And I like the fact that the government of Rwanda has really sort of, you know, come up with initiatives to say, okay, let me give a classic example of the Gikondo Industrial Park. We are moving a huge industry like Rwanda for example, but we are going to give you free land and build for you in the special economic zone. Exactly. How many people will they be able to do that for? I'm not too sure. Yeah. How sustainable is that? I am not too sure. So there's a huge aspect of awareness that needs to be implanted because it touches on our stomachs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely, it touches on our stomachs.
Yes. Yeah, just to also mention, sometimes I feel there are some critical areas that are not talked about so much, but have a big impact also on conservation. Yes. Population growth.
Yes.
You know, around the world, I think Africa currently still has the highest fertility rates. You know, that is a problem for conservation. Even in our country here, if Rwanda currently is among the most densely populated, we have to carefully think about what that means, you know.
Even though we have a family policy.
Yes. Yes.
Then
what that means. And in addition to that, agriculture, how you get to also move climate smart farming, how you get that done, conservation agriculture. Yes. So yes, we have so much, I think Rwanda has made so much progress around wildlife, but how you...
It's not in a silo, there are many other things.
How you integrate that.
Charles, if you bear with me, just hold your thought. Because
I want to talk about agriculture and the point Beatrice raised about local government and awareness.
Okay, hold your thought. Yeah. Because, you know, like you know, in our culture, we give precedence to our guests, and I can see Mr. Kadu Sebunya very...
Itching.
Something. So, yeah, please, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. I'm unsettled with Charles's reactions. And I think you've got to look at this in its totality. And let me start by giving you a very good example. We have been in Kinigi for 4 years. Working closely with the government of Rwanda. And you know, just a small project we've done there with the communities there. They own a high-end lodge. One of the first in Rwanda is owned by the communities of Kinigi. This lodge pumps between $300,000 and $500,000, $300,000 and $500,000 annually in our community. The land the lodge is sitting on, before the lodge was constructed, it was pumping into the community less than $4,000 annually. Because they were growing corn and potatoes. So the response to people's needs is not so much of where they are. The people who are carrying sand and a sand driver, that's not their dream. So the idea is not sustain a driver to carry sand forever, and then their children also carry sand. The role of the government, really, is to look at an economy, the people, and design an economy that can help people to prosper, but sustainably. The people of Kinigi, we found them growing papyrus. Pyrethrum.
Yes.
That's their main crop right now around Virogas. Each family household has about, say, now I'm guessing, about an acre, less than an acre. They're about between 4 to 6 people in a family. How can that be sustainable? That somehow the government will let these people have 1 acre, there are 6 people, their way of life is agriculture. When the parent is going to pass on this 1 acre to 6 children, they are going to divide it among themselves, and somehow that is sustainable development. So when the government, as it is now, we are working with the government, is saying, look, we really need to develop an alternative economy. The economy our people are now carrying out in Kinigi is not sustainable for themselves. But we need to make sure, we are very careful to make sure that the economies developed here are compatible to the ecology we have for the Virunga National Park. And it's less actually about gorillas, because Virunga Park offers services. You know, it's a water tower for the entire region. You destroy it, there will hardly be rain. I can guarantee you.
Thank you, thank you.
I'm
sorry, this is a conversation. I know we have to have part 2, part 3, part 4. We have less than 20 minutes left. We have not yet touched on financing and climate change adaptation. But Mr. Sebunya, I totally agree with what you're saying. We have the totality, there's a bigger picture. And I think to Charles's point, we need to create more awareness about the issue. I think that's a key thing. Awareness campaigns, to just the way you've explained it, the way you understand it, across the board, this is something that needs to be understood, especially by communities around these protected areas. I would like us to move to our next point.
Can I just say one thing on that
Charles,
one? Yes.
Make it
just very, very,
I know you also have a lot to say.
You see, sometimes we may look at gorillas and the Chinigi area and we think it's a wow factor. But I want to speak into Kadu's point and localize it here in Kigali. You know, when the government of Rwanda waged a war against people who are occupying the wetlands, one of the biggest culprits were guys who are running garages and maize mills. Now, historically, we knew that a garage operator or a garage owner is supposed to be a dirty, filthy guy. Fast forward, today we hang out at garages. For crying out loud, the best wine store in Rwanda with the best restaurant in Kigali today at the moment is at a garage.
And this goes to Kadu's point.
It's
a more sustainable change.
Yes. I have a very good friend who has a coffee shop where we take our cars for servicing. I never used to take my car for servicing at all. I would send somebody because the place was too filthy down in Gasiatan, wherever it was. So I think it's about how you package some of these things. When maize mills, we have a common friend, all of us, whose parents were up in arms that they had been chased away from that area around Utexira with their maize mill. Today they are packaging maize and we're buying it off the shelves in the supermarkets. So I think the awareness sometimes, the way you package it, and this is Beatrice's role with the other actors, to be able to explain to people that when you're chased away, you're actually being shown a new opportunity.
Exactly. Yes. So the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. I would like, Brenna, I know you had something to say. If you could just quickly move to the next point.
I think all that speaks to the need for the political will.
Yes, absolutely.
If we go to Westlands, in some countries, people are still being given permits, construction permits, in a wetland. In a wetland. Totally because of corruption.
Exactly, exactly. I'd like to go to the next part of the conversation, which is to do with climate change adaptation. And this is, Mr. Sebunya, you talked on it briefly, and I had to cut you short because you were coming back to it. And, it's unfortunate that Africa contributes to less than 3% of global emissions, but it now has to turn to climate change adaptation. We had actually a conversation on COP26 last year, soon after it happened, and it was so disappointing, the outcomes of COP26, especially to countries like Africa that are bearing the brunt of pollution worldwide by, more developed countries in the actions that the largest emitters, so to speak. My quick question, if you can try and be succinct as possible, what are African countries, including Rwanda, doing to to combat climate change effects on protected areas specifically? Beatrice, I'll start off with you before we go to Mr. Kadu. Just briefly talking about Rwanda's efforts in this regard.
Thank you, Jen. Rwanda has made good efforts in linking climate change with biodiversity conservation and also protected areas. To begin with, as the climate agenda of Rwanda, we have the nationally determined contributions. And with the nationally determined contribution, these are the commitment to the Paris Agreement, where we have what kind of activities when it comes about adaptation, what kind of activities when it comes about mitigation or cross-cutting we are planning as a country to reduce our emissions. So this is in climate change. But also when it comes about conservation, when it comes about protected areas, we have policies. We have the biodiversity policies I talked about earlier, but also have the NBSAPs, what we call NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans. And those strategic action plans, we have different efforts that shows how we're going to protect different areas and how we're going to see, to put in place activities that prevent the biodiversity loss, but also help us to increase the social and economic aspects of the protected areas. So this is one of the aspects, and the two are linked. We do not see climate as a standalone and biodiversity conservation and protected areas conservation as a standalone. We try to link them. So, for example, when we talk about rehabilitation of degraded areas, when we talk about Rwanda being part in the Bond Challenge, where we agreed to have more than 2 million trees planted between now to 2020 to 2030. So I think this is a good example where if we have this coverage and the trees planted, we not only tackle the issue of climate change, but the rehabilitation and protected area as well. Though protected area, the way it is, I think it's just defined the protected areas, the areas with those legally protected, but we have also efforts that are being done, not only in the parks or formal protected areas. Look at the efforts we are making, for example, in the projects like the Green Gicumbi. When we talk about Green Gicumbi and we bring the number of hectares we have rehabilitated, we have seedlings and tree seedlings that are being planted for fruits to cater for the food security. We have seedlings for the bamboos to protect the river banks. So I think those are also the conservation efforts we are making, to speak. And also, if we talk about this one, I will also go to the example of the Green City Kigali, if I may. This is pilot project that we are thinking with the under the FONERWA, the Green Fund, where we're having to tackle the issue of urban resilience through the nature-based solutions. So all those are the efforts that we are making to really try to engage different partners from international to national to come up with tangible results on the ground when it comes about protecting and conserving the protected area, but also the environment at large.
Thank you, Beatrice. And I like how you talked about it in the sense that these efforts are not being done in silos. You know, the focus is not on one area and another area. You know, as a country, we're trying to link this. In the interest of time, Mr. Sebunya, I'll go straight to financing because you kind of already touched on climate change adaptation. You know, Africans being victims, but you know, it's time to change this narrative and really take steps on how we can deal with this, even though we are not, you know, the largest emitters of issues that are causing climate change. But my question to you is to do with financing. Just briefly, when it comes to protected areas, biodiversity conservation, how much do we need? What does it look like? Can we achieve this? Just a snapshot of financing when it comes to biodiversity conservation.
The gap is huge. We have a deficit of about 70% of the financing of our protected areas properly, and we need about close to $2 billion annually for the entire continent to secure the existing parks, without even talking about the expansion of the corridors that are necessary for us to deal with. So there's a financial gap. but it's smaller. When you hear $2 billion annually for rural areas, you think it's a lot of money. But compared to, say, the money we are spending on vaccines, which could have been avoided if we had spent $2 billion on conservation. If you look at that, our budget for infrastructure on the continent is in trillions of dollars. If you look at our budgets for education, it's in trillions of dollars. Whereas we know we are not going to be successful in maintaining the infrastructure we are building for our economies, which is in trillions of dollars, without addressing conservation. You've seen the flooding. I mean, Durban just a few weeks ago was washed away. You've seen right now. I was seeing videos in Turkey that towns are just bursting into flames because of heat. It's going to happen here in Africa. We are seeing more droughts. We are seeing more wildfires. So the threat is real. So we need to find a way of financing. What we are discussing in Kigali this week and in this conference is a Pan-African, a construct of a Pan-African financing mechanisms for protected areas. The governments have signed, they're supporting these initiatives, and majority of people here in Kigali are supporting that initiative. We are suggesting that a Pan-African mechanism needs to be created because we cannot survive on this continent without taking care of this, and it cannot be left only to a country. Rwanda can do whatever Rwanda wants, but if DRC or Uganda doesn't pay a similar attention to the Virungas, all the efforts Rwanda is doing won't achieve the goals. Most of our natural resources are transboundary. All our rivers start from one part of the area. The Congo Basin, for example, supplies almost 60% of the water we use in Southern Africa. Angola supplies all the water that is needed in Botswana. Gambia supplies all the water for Senegal and other regions. So you see that interconnectedness requires us to come together as Africa and say, how do we secure these important areas? What management framework can we put in place? That's the discussion going on. We need about, like I said, $2 billion a year, but we need to start from somewhere. All this money is not going to conservation, to Charles's point. We believe at African Wildlife Foundation that if you are going to secure a protected area, you invest every $1 you invest in a protected area, you need to invest $2 outside protected areas in supporting the economies of the people that bear the pain of wildlife. You've just talked about, just last point I'll make, we've just talked about naming of gorillas. Wonderful. We've just talked about the population is growing, but the earth has a limit. So we cannot focus, and that's where the problem of colonial conservation. We cannot focus our conservation, and our only indicator of success is the number of gorillas. Our success is going to depend on how well the people around the mountain gorillas are doing, what economies they have that are compatible to the mountain gorillas or any other landscape that can help us continue the ecological systems or ecological infrastructure that both wildlife and people depend on. And that is the key. It's the economy. It's not the conservation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sebunya. Charles Bena, we really don't have time, but if you can make your points as brief as possible, please.
It's not going to be a walk in the park. Beatrice does talk about the Kigali Green City project and the huge expectations around that. The more you green, the more you think about greening, the more expensive it is.
In the short term, though.
Yes.
In the short term.
Yeah, but I mean, these are private investors that you're asking to do some of these things. That's why you see there's not been one single project that you can talk about in that whole Kigali Green City area because guys have abandoned their project, including a government-related entity. It's extremely expensive to go green. So we need initiatives, and some of these can be really homegrown initiatives. I'll give you only two examples in the interest of time. We've just gone through, we are in the middle of a very interesting phase of very affordable mortgage in the affordable housing space. Imagine if we heavily subsidize a green bond or a green mortgage for that matter, and said anyone who's going green, instead of getting money from the central bank at whatever amount, it's going to be less by 5%. Imagine what that would do. I am particularly disturbed that the holiday on e-cars is only lasting, I think, another few months.
The tax holiday.
Yes, yes, yes. I think that should be in eternity. Yeah. Such things that will allow us to.
I hear you.
Yes,
I
yes,
hear you.
yeah, yeah.
Brenna, very briefly.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned going green is expensive, so you have to be willing to take the risk.
Absolutely.
Long term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've come to the end of the show. Brenna, I liked your points on you're a conservative pessimist or skeptist, but your point absolutely on the, as a continent, the political will and ability, realistically speaking, to meet these standards is something definitely. It's not going to be a walk on the park. In the park, Charles, I totally hear you about packaging the awareness, even to the most, from grassroots level. It's very important. Mr. Kadu Sebunya, it's been an honor having you on the show. Very valid points. Wishing you all the best with APAC as you continue. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Thank you very much. Beatrice Chiza, it's been great being here on behalf of the Ministry of Environment. We're very honored, and thank you for your insights on what Rwanda is doing as a country in biodiversity conservation efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
Great. We've not had time to read our tweets, but I promise, as usual, on The Square, we'll be having this conversation after the show, just engaging, learning more, and sharing insights. So thank you very much for those who have been sharing their tweets. To our viewers, thank you very much for tuning in. To our partners, Made in Rwanda, Uzi Collections, Bourbon Coffee, and the rest, thank you so much for supporting The Square. And have a good night. See you again next week.